This is the Sustainable Goat Podcast.
We look to nature for how we should interrelate to the world. All the answers are within nature if we take the time to listen.
But what we have to find is a reasonable way how to handle plastic.
You know, consumers expect more. They're expecting brands to be more sustainable. They're choosing sustainable brands.
These are the stories and ideas from those that will define a generation. I'm your host, Steve Castanem, and this is our planet in focus. You have this really impressive background working for Department of Energy and now Curio. But I guess my question to start would be, where did this fascination with energy begin?
Well, yeah, that's interesting because like so many things in life, serendipity has a hand to play. They say the harder you work, the luckier you are. And I think that's been a mark of certainly my path forward. Look, I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, a lot of blue collar environment, hardworking. They don't suffer fools lightly. I went to a public school there in high school. At some point, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to get into some type of national security or international relations type job. And I remember mentioning to some of my fellow students in high school that I was thinking I was going to move to Washington, D.C., by gosh, and I'm going to get a job, maybe a diplomat or maybe working in national security or something, international relations. I really didn't know what I was really talking about, but it sounded intriguing enough that I was focused on that. I did find my way eventually to Washington, D.C., American University grad school, international relations. No, I don't have a nuclear engineering degree. No, I don't even have a science degree. I have 30 years at the Department of Energy on-the-job training, working in science-based missions with a lot of brilliant people that had mercy on me over the years and patience to teach me some basics in science, energy, and nuclear, ultimately. But the long story short is really I came to D.C. to get into an international relations or some type of national security position. And it was not easy to get into that career field. I certainly felt like I was the only one walking around Washington, D.C. without a career job. And so I basically was about to throw in the towel, move down to New Orleans. In fact, I did move back down to New Orleans. And then I ended up finding myself working in hotels because I worked in hotels and graduate in school to help supplement my income. Next thing you know, I'm moving up the ladder, assistant general manager of a hotel on Bourbon Street of all places. And about a year into it, here comes, of all things, a Department of Energy delegation, and I had to greet the head of the delegation. And so I'm talking to him for a few minutes, only about a 15-minute conversation. And I ended up mentioning that I recently moved from D.C., went to graduate school. He said, well, McGinnis, what the heck are you doing down in New Orleans? I said, couldn't get a job. And he was one of these internal apparatchik type, knows how to work the system, been around for a long time at the Department of Energy. He said, give me your resume. I gave him my resume. Within 4 weeks, literally 4 weeks, I'm back in D.C. working in headquarters at the Department of Energy. And he said, it's not the job you're going to want to do for the rest of your life. You're going to be a FOIA and Privacy Act specialist, which meant Freedom of Information and Privacy Act, which meant I get all my clearances. I'm going to be working, rubbing shoulders with all these cool offices, foreign intelligence, counterintel, defense programs, energy, nuclear energy. But I was going to be just doing a lot of, well, I don't want to say mind-numbing because it was very enlightening. Reviewing documents, main job of mine was reviewing documents to decide whether they should remain classified or declassified. So I learned a lot about the history, some of the skeletons in the closet for the Department of Energy and AEC and others. So it was ultimately a good thing. And then I ended up getting a lucky break and I got a position as a nuclear intelligence analyst. And I did that for a year. I was a daily intel briefer. And another mark of my career was volunteering to do things others did not want to do. And so in this case, no one wanted to be the daily intel briefer because that meant you had to come into the skiff and open everything up at about 3:30 in the morning, go through all the world's EMINT, SIGINT, HUMINT, all the intelligence traffic, last minute in the briefings and go up and brief assistant secretaries, maybe the secretary of energy, while they're having a cup of coffee in 15 minutes, running out, and then you're done. I love that. I was a kid in a candy store, but a lot of the seasoned Intel officers, like, that's the last thing I want to do. And then that led to another break where I'm briefing the number 2 for nuclear nonproliferation, old B-52 pilot, really a great guy. He worked at the White House, President Reagan, SIAP advisor, the boss of the guy who carried the nuclear football. Great gravitas and experience. And he just took a liking to me, and he asked me to come up and be a special assistant. I stayed there for 7 years, rising as senior advisor. Then I got into, and this is nuclear nonproliferation, loose nukes. And then I ended up standing up secretarial task force on nuclear and radiological threat reduction, got like 24 countries together, was very successful. And then as a result of all that, so I'm getting a long-winded way to your question, that represented about halfway through my career, 15 years of my 30 years at the Department of Energy. And then with that experience, at that moment, it was under President Bush. And Bush had started this new global initiative to help the U.S. leapfrog back into the leadership role for nuclear, among other things. And frankly, it was predicated on the idea of bringing in a new next generation fleet of fast reactors in combination with our current type of light water reactors, I would call, and predicated on recycling, reprocessing, and having this kind of closed, self-sustaining loop and offering all those services internationally for nuclear exports, et cetera. They had started this, and it's called Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, was GNUP. And the president really, he was literally personally talking about it, at times without a talking point. He said, I had to go to Indonesia and meet with the minister, and it was a couple of weeks after President Bush had gone. And the minister seemed really surprised, taken aback, because he said, I was part of the delegation that greeted him. And the first thing he said is, oh, you're the energy minister. You need to know about GNUP. It's like, what's GNUP? So now I'm meeting with you. Tell me, what is this GNUP? So I was asked to stand up the G and the P of GNUP, Global Nuclear Energy Partnership. We had a nascent, fairly robust R&D, nuclear energy R&D aspect, but we did not have any partners internationally. We had greased the skids, but no true partnership. So I was asked to bring my experience from my nonproliferation days, loose nukes and other things, having pulled together 24 countries, and then see if I could do that for GNUP in the civilian side, the peaceful side, the other side of the nuclear coin, as I call it. It was a journey, as much of a diplomatic, strategic, a head-to-head battle royal within Washington on how to structure it. It was during a time when Russia still wanted to maintain this bipolar, co-dominant world order, Russia and the U.S., but Russia was not the Soviet Union, not in that position any longer. And there was really not much acceptance of the idea that we're going to do that. So when I proposed from scratch with some other colleagues how we would structure this, my insistence was to do something totally different. I like to be disruptive and I like to be sincere, but I like to always be empathetic and think about what's the best way to really get things accepted and have impact. And during the Bush years, we were known as unilateralists. You may recall President Bush and Iraq and unilateral. We just stormed the doors, go in, no consensus building. So I convinced others at the Department of State and the White House and DOE in particular that we should absolutely show that we are not that. So we're going to have a co-equal international organization. Everybody has a co-equal vote. We will invite not just countries in nuclear, those who are thinking about it. We'll invite anti-nuclear, like Germany at the time, pro-nuclear, like China, Russia, invite Kenyans and Ghanaians and others, just Armenians and Indonesians. To this day, it's still in existence. And there's, I think, 63 countries now with 4 international organizations. It's under a different name. But I led that as a founding chair for 11 years as part of my work in the Office of Nuclear Energy when I had come over from the nonproliferation side under Bush to stand it up. And so 11 years I served at first as Deputy Assistant Secretary, of energy for international nuclear cooperation policy, R&D, all the bilateral, the multilateral, and things like me running GNEP. Did that for 11 years. And then they asked me to step up and serve as, under Secretary Rick Perry at the time, Assistant Secretary of Nuclear Energy. And I did that for 2.5 years. Secretary Perry used to say, I love my actings because the process was so absolutely elongated and it was very difficult to get appointees into position quickly. And so I did that 2.5 years. And then after that, they asked me to go over to the White House and stand up the president's PCAS, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. It's a storied advisory committee, highest of the land for science and technology, and under different names. It's been around since Roosevelt. And so I did that, and I had to pinch myself every day going to work. It was so amazing. And then more serendipity happens, and I'll conclude my long-winded sort of response or narrative. So I'm at the White House, and I serendipitously met the founder of the company that I lead now as president and CEO. The company is named Curio, and we have 3 different companies: Curio Legacy Ventures, focused on nuclear recycling, and then we have Curio Solutions, that includes advanced nuclear reactors and others, and isotopes. But I'm at the White House, I serendipitously met this founder. He's brilliant. Turns out it's like he's a brother from a different mother for me. I'm very open-minded, and I end up having unexpected partners and friends. And so I always felt like I dedicated so much to nuclear energy in my career, and I always felt great sort of almost remorse that we have so utterly failed in addressing and solving the nuclear waste problem. And we have that fundamental obligation. If we want to be a generator of electricity through nuclear, we have a moral and solemn obligation to also not pass on an unresolved mess of a problem called the No Nuclear Waste Plan to the next generation. In fact, in the nature of nuclear waste, when it comes out of a reactor, nuclear fuel goes in a reactor, and after it's enriched, mined and converted and enriched, and it runs for about 5 years in a reactor in the U.S., and then it's pulled out. And once you pull it out, it's at its highest level, or one of its highest levels of radiotoxicity in its existence. And it's so high in radiotoxicity with particular fission products that if you left untreated, if you do not reprocess or process that material any further and you just leave it there, it is unsafe for humans to be around for 10,000 years. In fact, let's say the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a regulatory body, federal, of the nuclear sector, if you are going to build a facility to permanently dispose of that without recycling, they require you to show 100,000 year and then 1,000,000 year standard. That is mind-boggling and almost incredible if you're looking at public acceptance and understanding of what you're doing. So when I met the rabbi, that was what I was going to say, that life works in mysterious ways. So when I met this individual, he came in tow at the White House with 3 CEOs. One was nuclear, and they were not expecting it. So they knew me as the nuclear guy, having been the Department of Energy Assistant Secretary. So they scrambled about 20 minutes before the meeting and asked me to come over. And I come to the meeting, West Wing group. It was in the EEOB, but in the White House complex. And I go there, and much of the discussion ended up being involving me talking about nuclear. And the founder of my company, Curio, just took a liking. We had common views on the incredible challenges and the amazing low-hanging fruit opportunities with recycling of nuclear waste. We can talk about it later, but because of not science, but because of government policies over the years, back to Carter, where there was a self-imposed moratorium, no more reprocessing. We were reprocessing commercially up until President Carter. President Carter was convinced by national security folks, and I worked with a lot of those types when I was in the non-proliferation side, convinced them to put in place a moratorium on any reprocessing of our nation's used nuclear fuel that comes out of a reactor on the grounds of international security. If we self-impose and not do it, we will have a better chance in talking the North Koreans, the Pakistanis, other countries, Iran. We will have a better chance, moral high ground, talking them into not reprocessing. And in the business of nuclear, there are sometimes the dual use technology calculus, and that is nuclear technology can be a double-edged sword. It may not be the most efficient path to secretly develop a nuclear weapon, but the inherent technologies of certain types of certain parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, like the back end, what we call for reprocessing, that can be potentially a pathway for bad actors secretly taking the technology and secretly using it to build a nuclear bomb program. It may not be the most efficient, but it does have dual use. So it's super sensitive. And so he was convinced, Carter, to stop doing it in the U.S. for the sake of trying to stem the tide for proliferation of sensitive nuclear technologies globally. What that did, though, was overnight basically turned this material that has an incredible amount of value still in it. I didn't mention that the nuclear fuel, when it's run in a reactor, it's only used about 4% of the energy value by the time it's pulled out after 5 years. Not to mention a whole bunch of valuable isotopes that are in high demand in the market today, medical, industrial, space-based, and back then too. And so because of government policy, the decision was to no longer reprocess. It overnight turned that into nuclear waste. And it turned it into now one of our greatest legacy problems to deal with. And then on top of it, Congress passed a law later, and I believe 83 started and then amended it over time, Nuclear Waste Policy Act, saying the Department of Energy, federal government's going to be responsible for picking up that so-called waste since you're not going to reprocess it. And guess what happened? We were supposed to start picking up in 1997, never did. Suddenly, no one is incentivized to deal with that so-called waste. And it's not waste, it's anything but waste. There's enough energy value still in the fuel, in the used fuel, sitting around pads in this country, enough to meet our electricity needs for the next 150 years. We're sitting on a gold mine. We're sitting on a national treasure trove of not only clean, carbon-free generation fuel, but an enormous amount of high-demand isotopes for medical purposes, for space-based power sources, industrial. But to get back to the close out the little serendipitous thing at the White House. So I met him. I always felt like that's one of my areas that I had great regret that we never solved the nuclear waste problem. We did get ahead of steam and acceptance in Congress and others that we need to bring in a next generation of nuclear reactors and that we have to do everything to save our current fleet. We have the largest nuclear fleet in the world. We have historically always had that. China's on our heels right now trying to give us a run for our money, but we still lead in the technical innovation. We now have a growing bipartisan recognition, whether it's because of climate change, fighting and needing nuclear, whether it's jobs, energy security, whether it's geostrategic, Russia and China dominating the global nuclear market, whatever it is on the Republican or Democratic side or what have you, there is, I would say, an historic and unique convergence of strong-based bipartisan support for nuclear, but it's been focused on bringing in new reactors and supporting the current. But there still has not been anything to address the nuclear waste problem. And oh, by the way, under Reagan did rescind the moratorium on reprocessing that Carter put in, but really it never took off for a bunch of reasons I can explain later. And industry really never came in to fill that breach, partly because the Nuclear Waste Policy Act said, hey, the federal government's going to take all that so-called nuclear waste that's sitting around in all these nuclear reactors, so utilities don't worry about it. So when I met the founder, he's a rabbi. He lives in New York City. He's 35 at the time, almost half my age. And he had just really started doing due diligence in nuclear about 2 years prior. And I was just floored how much he knew. He was up to speed on issues that took me 30 years to get up to speed on. And so, but I was all in. I was at the top of my position in government. I had no mandatory retirement. I did not have to leave government, but I want to make a difference in life. And if it means take a risk, It's almost always both go hand in hand. I decided I am punching out of government. I'm going to retire, and I am going to try and make one last big difference in the private sector this time and lead this nuclear technology innovation company that's trying to change the world, or at least trying to totally transform the nuclear sector, get it once and for all in an environmentally sustainable, circular economy manner that has as much of a benefit for the environment as it does for really finding once and for all an economically robust, private, financially sustainable approach to dealing with our so-called nuclear waste and removing this albatross from the neck of the American taxpayer. So there you have it.
Wow. I mean, I think one of the more amazing parts of your story, I mean, of course, all of the things that you've been involved in, but you were willing to take a risk on something when you started. You did something that I'm going to go to Washington and I'm going to work in the government. And what I find fascinating about that is effectively the first go around, you failed in the sense of you didn't get a job, but you had the persistence to keep going and call it serendipity, but also call it preparation meets opportunity. You had this opportunity that you wouldn't have had in Washington, D.C., but you got it in New Orleans. And I think that, when you start to look at how humans get involved in what they want to do in the world, in how they want to change the world, I think sometimes they see the end game, right? You worked in the White House, you had all these things. You're very much like every other person when you started. And you had this like curiosity and this drive. Is that something that you find to be, I don't want to say the secret sauce, but like in anything that somebody wants to do? I mean, I highly doubt that you were forecasting that you would be in the position that you're in when you first started working in government, or even when you said, I'm going to move to DC. Do you think that kind of skill set to be in the skiff at 3:30 in the morning, do you think that that's kind of the secret sauce? It's the willingness to keep persisting?
Everybody's different. Everybody has different things that drive them and tick. And in many ways, yes, Steve. But I would say even more for me personally, it was trying to prove myself that I belonged. It was trying to prove, there's people have insecurities, right, at times. And I believe in being honest about it. And I think growing up in Metairie, the suburb of New Orleans, and avoiding a lot of my science classes. And even though at the end of the day, I did well in school, Mr. Scholastic, highest GPA and best athlete with the highest GPA in 1 year, not high school. Actually, it was ninth grade. After I straightened up, I had a really bad time. My poor mother divorced when I was 7 years old, and I was a delinquent. But fortunately, I face planted really early in life. But when I face planted, it made me, I always looked envious at those who were doing great in school, who were the super smart kids, who were the class presidents, and I was so envious and, just almost dreaming of being able to get my life together to do something, be in a position like that. I think I spent most of my career feeling like I had to make up for so many things. I was expelled from school 2 years in a row. So 1 year I couldn't even go to any school, and they said, get a job or we're taking you away from your mother. So that was in 8th and 9th grade, believe it or not. So everybody's different. For me, it's like a lot of my drive was, first of all, I can't believe I'm working in Washington, D.C. after I had such close calls with being not even getting out of high school, being taken away from my mother, to never looking back. In fact, I jumped the grade in high school just to make up so I could graduate on the year that I was expelled and couldn't go to school. And my whole life has been so everybody has a different set of motivations. For me, that has been a root cause, and that is I want to make a difference in life. I'm a giver. I like to do things that are good, whether it's personal relationships or working. I thrive off of thinking that I'm doing something that others appreciate. Not everybody's like that. That's how I am. I'm wired that way. So the combination of wanting to make up and prove myself I belong and I can do this, and I get into these cool jobs with security clearances, and suddenly I'm representing the United States. It's a dream come true, pinch myself. And on top of it, I want to make a difference in life. That's just how.
Well, and without a science background, like for example, I don't have a science background. I did very, very poor in chemistry. I did all right in biology, but you have this like nuclear energy as a whole, or just the word nuclear, very much has a connotation that goes with it. A bomb, Oppenheimer, Fukushima, bad things. And I feel like through your experience and truly an organic discovery process, you're able to see this kind of side of, well, this is actually kind of a miracle type of material that has a lot of capability that, for me personally, I think it's been miscommunicated. I mean, even in our brief conversations, it's like, wow, there's a whole world I don't understand, and I'm actually even interested in it. What has been the kind of the history of nuclear? Because I think that that part has been so misunderstood as to the application and the value that it actually has in the world.
Yeah, I mean, and first of all, let me just, before I hit the history, I do think it's important for your listeners and others to know that you don't have to be an engineer or a scientist to understand nuclear technologies, nuclear energy, or other technology beyond just producing electricity through a nuclear power plant, isotopes and exciting other applications. Nuclear plays key roles in our agricultural food chain to make sure food is safe, saving lives every day and fighting cancer and others. Space exploration. I mean, how many people know that most of the Mars rovers are powered by a plutonium-238 source? How many people know that only two man-made objects in interstellar space continue to send us signals and is powered by a plutonium-238 source? My office was the one that was lead for engineering that and putting it together. But the point is, when I moved up in my career, first of all, I was already used to feeling like I'm sort of the Rodney Dangerfield. I don't have the credentials. I don't have, even when I was in Intel, they're like, who is this kid? I mean, he doesn't have any background from the intelligence community, nothing else. And it was always like that. Every job I took, nuclear energy, I was one of the few non-nuclear engineers and scientists. Assistant secretary, I think it was the first one that led the office that didn't have a PhD or a science degree in my name.
Do you think that had value, though, because you had an outside perspective, so to speak?
So, yeah, and that was what I was going to get to. I mean, I'm biased, but, I try to be honest about what my strengths and weaknesses are. I learned that from my old boss. Heaven forbid if you don't recognize your weaknesses and everybody sees it but you, and you go through your whole life blindly doing it all the time, right? But what was good for me, I think, and the organizations is that basically I describe it as a lot of nuclear engineers are linear thinking and very scientific, very linear. I'm the opposite. I haven't been trained with, mathematics based or, equation based and science-based, solution-based. I'm a nonlinear guy. So I tend to look for the invisible dots and try and figure out how whatever field, whatever subject, what are the things that are the invisible dots that connect, that make sense to me to understand what this field is. And I took that approach for nuclear. Number one, though, is I think I help because I'm a nonlinear guy. I came on board and stood up the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership. Also, there's a little masochistic side, taking a risk and knowing that you're going to incur some pain, but it's worth it. I mean, I had people over and over saying, "What in the world are you doing, McGinnis? You're like you're a moth to a flame. Why do you keep volunteering for these big and possible things like GNEP, Global Nuclear Energy Partnership?" But frankly, the combination, I think it was a blessing in disguise that I wasn't academically, scientifically trained, because I complemented the office that was dominated by scientists. And I ended up being one of the elements of the sauce. And I think that's one reason why I rose up. And then to some of the doubting Thomases that are engineers saying, what the heck is he doing in this office? He doesn't belong here. And then to the horror, I'm doing so well, I'm moving up. And to the horror, I become their boss, and they're the boss's boss's boss. But I always try to be humble and lift them up. Never pretend you're someone you're not. Never pretend. Never even try and suggest you're a nuclear engineer if you are not a nuclear engineer. Lift everybody up and be a part of it. No better compliment for me than having someone working under me become a rising star and catapults far higher than I ever get. I think that's a wonderful compliment. So I think that has been a key And that's why I think a lot of organizations and companies, it's really, really important to have a mixture of expertise, mixture of. My top chief of staff in the Office of Nuclear Energy, he got his degree in history, and he is absolutely beloved by the engineers. And so, yes, you need aptitude, you need a willingness to learn. But at the end of the day, I think, a lot of hard work and luck. And like you said, it's a combination. So to the history of nuclear energy and Oppenheimer, we gave half a day off for our engineers. We have this nuclear engineering team. They're so awesome. They're median age is about half my age. I'm by far the oldest guy here. And they just love anything tech related. I've got nuke engineers. I've got mechanical engineers. They don't call themselves mechanical engineers. They call themselves mecha, like Mecha Godzilla. And and not mechanical like Mecha Godzilla. They have great sense of humor. And we have radiochemical engineers. And we have a small core of about seven of them in my headquarters here in Washington, D.C. And then we have about 3 times that out in the national labs where we fund them at the Department of Energy's national labs. We're leading nuclear labs. But I call them our nuclear skunk works team, our team, because there is nothing they won't go after. They love challenges, and I can give you a couple of stories later. But the bottom line is nuclear energy. So we took them out to see Oppenheimer, the movie, gave them half the day off, and a couple of them even brought their wives, and just had a blast. No pun intended. And so we're watching it, and it did remind us, and it reminded me, what an incredibly difficult, if not even dark moment in our history with Nazi Germany and the Axis, and just the lives lost, the race to save. It's not black and white always. The nuclear bomb, drop it, or I mean, the whole thing was an incredible moment in our history, and nuclear technology was used to obviously build nuclear weapons and prove that out. And in fact, the plutonium bomb in the Manhattan Project the plutonium was derived from reprocessing. So you have a uranium bomb, then you have Batman, which is the plutonium bomb and the implosion bomb. And that plutonium is essentially man-made. You have to have fission for the most part. You have to create a reactor, and then the plutonium is generated. And then you have to figure out how to extract that plutonium in weapons-grade state of weapons-grade purity and quantity. So that program, that process of reprocessing, it's called Purex. This is I don't want to say the crazy thing, but this is where we are in the nuclear energy sector today. And one reason why we have an historic moment for a private-led transformational sort of sector to be reestablished called recycling by a small company like Curio. And reminds me of like Tesla or SpaceX in the 2000s. Elon Musk was mocked. Who does he think he's going to come in and do something that NASA couldn't solve or others? The hubris of him, right? He inspires me every day, what he's done, and everybody else, others working for him. But back then, the process for extracting plutonium for the weapons program was Purex. Today, France, Russia, Japan, UK for a long time, China, they reprocess, and you know what process they're using? The same process. It's called Purex. Now they've adopted it, they've refined it. In France, it's been amended and improved upon, but it's still inherently the same process where you're pulling up pure plutonium. What that means, and don't forget, that's the basis of Carter's being convinced by the non-pro community to put a moratorium in the United States on reprocessing, because the process used, Purex, going all the way back to the Manhattan Project, it involves a pure separation, pulling out pure plutonium that could then be used for a nuclear bomb. Maybe a harder pathway than others, but it can be done. That's the argument. So that process is not only a 70, 60-year-old process that has a fundamentally unacceptable element from a national security nuclear proliferation perspective in the United States to this day. There are strong non-proliferation stakeholders. Frankly, even in the Trump administration, there were some very strong anti-reprocessing senior government officials, political. And you have on the Dem side too, because they're used to, when they think of reprocessing, they think of the technology that is essentially was born out of the nuclear weapons program. And so we have the beauty, and a couple of other things on this. Even to this day, the legacy of reprocessing, all the reprocessing plants around the world, they're government owned, state owned. Even in France, it's a state owned large facility, very impressive at La Hague. And these are enormous facilities, usually the size of a small city. It's been government the whole time. They've never been wired on minimum overhead, maximum ROI, maximum efficiency. No, it's been quite the opposite. That's why, in many ways, that's why you see the golden opportunity here today, because the reprocessing sector around the world, state-owned, based on incredibly old technology. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention they also use an acid aqueous-based process that, ironically, you use it to dilute and to separate out the materials and pull out the plutonium and uranium. You're ironically creating a lot more high-level radioactive waste. So what's the benefit of, and one reason why I left the White House, left the government, is I couldn't believe this guy, the rabbi, he comes up with one of our prodigies in the office, our chief innovation officer. He's 30 years old. He is brilliant, and he's co-inventor of this nuclear technology they hatched. So the rabbi's talking to this nuclear engineer from University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and says, you know what? This is it. Recycling our nation's nuclear waste. He has a company in rare earth and critical minerals and all, a couple of them, or invests in it. They go in, among others, they're looking at going into old coal mines and then actually cleaning up by extracting rare earth and critical minerals and having a two-for benefit. Net environment impact on it, actually improve it, and then pull out valuable, needed, highly sought after rare earth and critical minerals. He said, we need to do that for the nuclear sector because they're sitting on a gold mine, more than that. That's called the nuclear waste around this country. 75 locations, now over 90,000 metric tons and growing, believe it or not. And stranded because the federal government has not been able to solve it. So here we have a golden opportunity for a private sector company, if we have enough chutzpah, and if we have enough experience, and it's good on the rabbi because I think he wisely judged that this needs to be private-led. It can't be government like the state-owned, huge, inefficient reprocessing plants around the world. They've never been incentivized to be efficient, truly. Just look at the product extraction. Use nuclear fuel. In our company, we've identified now, thus far, 11 different isotopes, some of which an individual isotope can carry $1 to $2 billion in revenue a year. Just one. And that doesn't include the fuel we would pull out. That's a good $1 billion to $2 billion a year. Our facility will be able to provide, by reprocessing, recycling this so-called waste, we can provide 40% of the U.S. domestic annual nuclear fuel requirement. Now, when you think about 20% still comes from Russia today. Why? Congress couldn't shut it down because the industry said if you did, we're so dependent and it would take so long to get new fuel qualified and contracts in place, we'll probably have rolling brownouts if you cut the Russians off right now.
So how does our energy actually work then? So when you think about energy grid, I think most people are kind of thinking, oh, well, I plug something in and the power's there. And it's mainly driven by coal, oil, and these plants, maybe not even thinking nuclear. What does our energy grid in the US, when it comes to demand and how much we're actually demanding more of the energy grid, where does all that come from?
Yeah, and so it's a decentralized grid, and it takes almost a degree to understand how, because it's so complex now, merchant markets, and then you have the regulated markets, and then you have ERCOT, which is Texas, pretty unique, pretty much an independent utility with their own generating assets. But I think the best way to think about it is, where do you live? Who is your utility? All right. What power plants does your utility own? So let's say, all right, in Virginia, Dominion, the utility. Well, how does Dominion generate electricity? With what power sources? And so that pretty much is going to be the majority of your answer. Where are you getting your electricity? So what does Dominion own? Dominion owns 2 large nuclear power plants. I think it's probably about 30% or so of the electricity in Virginia. They own natural gas, so you get electricity there. They own wind. They own solar. So if you have an account with Dominion, you're getting your electricity from some or a combination, usually a combination of those. And you might be getting some from other utilities neighboring where they're selling electricity. And maybe it's a neighbor that has no nuclear. Maybe it's a neighbor that has more nuclear. Illinois has the largest number of nuclear reactors in the country. We have 92 nuclear reactors operating right now. They're all quite large, called gigawatt electric size. Even California still has 1 nuclear power plant operating. So where do we get our electricity? We're getting it from an electricity grid that is made up of many, many, many different companies, utilities that generally own a power plant of whatever's nuclear, coal or natural gas or solar, wind. And then they're selling you the electricity from those assets. And right now, though, our electricity grid is going through, it's always changing. The grid's always evolving, but it's going through a particularly accelerated sort of transformational process, not only to meet the new demand, like electric vehicles. You want to talk about sucking up electricity and needing, if we ever get close to what we're going to need and what we're going for electric vehicles, we're going to need probably three times the number of nuclear power plants we have today, at least.
Well, and in terms of nuclear power generation too, isn't that the most, for lack of a better term, bang for your buck, meaning you get the most energy out of the energy put in?
Yeah. So there are a number of things that make nuclear utterly, absolutely unique from any other energy source. Set aside the issues of the debate on nuclear waste, set aside the issues and the important issues on nuclear safety and all that, which I think we're the leader in the world on that too. But what makes nuclear power that creates electricity unique is the density of the power. So what I mean by that is one nuclear power plant has the tiniest footprint compared to any other generation source. The amount of power we get from one nuclear reactor, so let's say a typical reactor in the U.S. is about a gigawatt of electricity, that it provides more density of power 24/7, 7 days a week, doesn't rely on sun coming up. It doesn't have any problem if it rains, sleets, or snows, or freezes in general. And not only that, but the capacity factor, what we're talking about too, that's really important. The capacity factor is basically how long is your generating asset for electricity? How long can it operate without stopping? Nothing comes close to nuclear. When you start a nuclear reactor, when you have a reactor running and you load the fuel, in the US, we don't refuel for about 18 to 24 months. So a nuclear reactor literally is generating electricity at what's called base load, full power, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, without stopping until 18 to 24 months. And then they refuel and then they start. There is nothing on Earth like that. And so it's the density, the footprint, very small footprint for the amount of power coming out. It's the longevity of the generation, the continuous generation, 18 to 24 months. Oh, by the way, it's carbon free. The jobs are remarkable. We're looking at locations to site our full commercial next generation nuclear recycling facility, state of the art. Remember, being a startup company, we were able to start from scratch, meaning the rabbi and his ideas and our chief innovation officer and co-inventor. We said, what he said is, I want 3 key things. One is I want to absolutely build in safeguard and security by design to make sure that we do everything to make sure it cannot be used for malevolent purposes, and it answers and addresses the concerns of the non-proliferation community. Number 2, we want it to be environmentally friendly and sustainable. Therefore, what does that mean? No acid aqueous process. Our process is a dry process. We use heat and fluorination. It's an amazing process. And it's modular, bringing in the latest and greatest. These other reprocessing plants can never do it. The facilities like in France, these are $20 billion facilities. They could never walk away from that sunk investment over generations and then just start from scratch. At least they haven't, and we don't think they will. We are in a unique historic moment from an investor perspective, from a transformational positive impact from the private sector for our country to solve this albatross around our neck, the nuclear waste problem, and turn it into societal good in a way that is just, it's mind-blowing to think about how much we could do, how much is in there that can be extracted for baseload non-carbon emitting, domestic, so we wouldn't have to be dependent on Russia and others, for medical isotopes, some of which the medical community can't get right now. Space-based power sources, that is a growing field. We have limited supply. And there's isotopes right now that Russia has a monopoly on, and I won't say which ones, that literally are not only key for our industry, but also for our national security and for the defense side of the house. And so there is a very vigorous effort to try and reestablish domestic production of some of these valuable isotopes. And guess what? They're sitting in this so-called nuclear waste around the country in quantities and volumes unmatched anywhere else. And so that's why we have offtake agreements with some of the leading isotope manufacturing companies like Eckert and Ziegler. They're the largest, in fact, a German company, large presence in the U.S. But we have a unique moment, again, like SpaceX did with reusable rockets, really transforming in such a positive way industry. And yes, you can be a startup and do that. And we believe that we are going to absolutely exponentially increase the nuclear market, which is what, about $150 billion a year in the market in the U.S., or give or take. We absolutely believe if we firmly establish nuclear recycling as part of the U.S. nuclear sector, where you have 12 states still today with moratoriums not allowing nuclear, almost all because of nuclear waste plant. If we demonstrate that we can take care of the nuclear waste safely, securely, and not burdening the American taxpayer in this wildly expensive process that had involved Yucca Mountain, where hundreds of billions, if not over $1 trillion price tag, let the private sector go at it like we saw with SpaceX. See what we can do. And we already have 3 government contracts we've won. We've only been around for about 2 years, and we're 3 for 3. And trust me, I know my former colleagues in DOE, they don't, especially in this area, nuclear, we were judged by some of the pioneers in our area that we're developing. So they pressure tested us every which way. They really like what they see. That's why they're now partnered with us. So we're 80% funded now by the Department of Energy's ARPA-E office, which is a very exciting tech to market, tech incubator, partnering company, organization, wind, solar, nuclear, everybody. Wherever it's clean tech, they're in on it, among others. We secured this. We're very proud we secured this grant or this contract. It's a 3-year runway, 80% funded by the federal government, the rest cost shared by Curio. And we have 4 national labs that joined us in applying for this grant. And we won. And I would argue we're the only game in town. Yes, there's some smaller scale recycling technologies being developed by other companies. We'd love to see it. There is, I can assure you, there is no other company that is right now attempting to bring to market a nuclear recycling facility that will be able to process at scale the 92,000 or so metric tons that we have in this country. And in fact, it'll be the largest nuclear recycling facility in the world for throughput, but the most compact. We have a lot of semi-autonomy built in. We have modularity built in. That's what happens when you have a clean slate and you can start from scratch and not be a legacy $20 billion government-run behemoth, right? We were able to put in the best of the best We got the best national labs partnered together, and now we're off to the races. So at the end of 3 years, what we're going to do is we will have demonstrated our full, what we call flow sheet, integrated flow sheet, our process with actual commercial used nuclear fuel that has already been identified at Idaho National Lab. And so as soon as we do that, we're going to scale up again. And it's all about de-risking. That's because what we're doing is hard. So it's all about due diligence and de-risk. So we're going to quickly then go to a pilot facility that is a little larger. And then we're going to go to an engineering scale where we're going to have one of what will be 10 three-story modules in a ultra-modern football stadium-sized facility. And we're going to, for the last stage before we go to this full commercial with 10 different modules, we're going to do one full module. And the beauty of having modular systems, we have 10 different modules. If one module goes down processing, the rest of the facility continues to operate. There is no other facility like that around the world. The other facilities, one part of the facility goes down, the whole thing shuts down. Like I said, the government owned. They're not wired as an existential threat of you better keep your books in order, you better be efficient, or go out of business. It's called the great Machiavellian force of the free market, which really turns on the juices, and part of the reason why I jumped into private sector. I always had so much respect for no safety net getting out there. And I think that's where you get some of the greatest innovation, when you have it all on the line. So we think that we're at a pivotal moment where nuclear is needed more than ever. We have a unique political stars in alignment. Another reason why I jumped out, because the chances of pulling this off have never been better. When you have a government that does not have a plan to figure this out yet, at most right now, one step is consolidated and stored. But a true solution, we're it. Now, compliments and kudos to the Department of Energy, and even in this administration now, because they saw fit to award us and to see if we prove this out. And I humbly believe that while this business will be incredibly lucrative, the biggest benefit by far, I believe, is environmental. We're in a world now where, in my humble opinion, on either side of the aisle, there's an expectation of doing things where you're at least environmentally conscious, that you want clean streams, clean air, and don't crap things up. Certainly don't crap it up if you don't have to, and then minimize. And so in other words, for example, if you're in a sector where your sector is still driven by finite resources, uranium is dug out of the ground, uranium mines, you can see in the US, that's a very difficult, extremely difficult thing to do, and that is get a permit for a uranium mine. Extremely difficult because of the sensitivities and other things. But if you are going to dig out uranium out of Mother Earth, and if you're going to do that, you should not only be using 4% and then attempting to throw it away at its highest level of radiotoxicity, and then literally tell the community that you're trying to convince to take it, oh, it's only going to be unsafe to be around for 10,000 to 100,000 years. Mind-boggling to think that that's a winning proposition, but it's a cumulative thing. A lot of smart people over the years trying to solve it, but we have gotten ourselves in this pickle. But like I said, right now, we're in a position to help be a solution, part of the solution for the United States and frankly, the world. We have the largest fleet still, and we could really demonstrate state-of-the-art, environmentally friendly, much more efficient, even privately sustainable, so it's not dependent on federal government dollars forever. We have an opportunity to do this. And it's a tech corridor. Some states, we're talking to several, and they are really enthusiastic. They love the idea. Some of these states are former coal states and still are. And they know coal is on its way out. Some of these communities we've gone to, former coal sites, flat top removed, we're looking for sort of remote areas, 400 or 500 acres, good rail, good power, and a lot of excess workforce, because our facility will employ about 3,000 full-time employees. Most of them will not be engineers and four-year degree. Most, and most people don't realize this, Even in a nuclear power plant, the majority of the people work there are trades-based. So the majority of them are either 2-year associate's degree with a heck of a lot of training, or even high school. And so same thing for us. But these are generational jobs. The facilities, nuclear power plant, now they're licensed up to 80 years, a lot of them. Our facility would start out with a 50-year, we hope, license and probably operate much longer. Can you imagine 3,000 jobs? And when I was down in one of these coal country areas, they loved the idea of having been the backbone of the industrial revolution, and then to transform themselves into the backbone, being the largest nuclear clean carbon-free producer of fuel, which you would have with our facility, in the world. This will be the largest total reprocessing capacity in the world. Russia, Japan, France, and everything else, about 2,400 metric tons a year. Our facility will process 4,000 metric tons a year. And within about 28 or 29 years of full operation, we will have reprocessed all of our nuclear waste, so-called waste, that's sitting around the country right now.
Wow. Well, and if you look at it from one, the scalability makes sense. It's the ability you already have existing waste. I think one of the big conversations in the sustainability space right now is the idea of circularity. It's this idea that, like, if you're going to provide another solution, whether that be solar panels, wind, whatever that power source is, there's a cost to that. There's a mining cost, there's a shipping cost, there's a waste cost. Like, what does the waste cycle look like, and how do you close the loop, so to speak?
And that's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, nuclear has that ability.
Right. We are going for closing the nuclear fuel cycle. And we want to go from right now, which is, we're arguing it's a non-carbon emitting, but we can say it's renewable. With certain advanced reactors, 2 of which we're developing, we can truly see a future where it's renewable, where we won't even have to mine. Can you imagine right now if we're sitting on the largest stockpile of non-carbon emitting fuel in the world? Just because of government policy, we designated it as waste. And rather than extract the remaining 96% or even a fraction of it for domestic non-carbon to help meet our climate change, to support the grid with the EVs, electric vehicles, and everything else, why on earth would we not do it? It's a no-brainer, not only from an economic, but also from an environmental perspective. I'm not saying we're not looking to displace the uranium mining sector. We think that all ships will rise if we really solve the nuclear waste problem. We are not a direct competitor to the uranium mining sector. But what we're saying is, we sure as heck in this day and age, in a circular economy world where we're very conscious about the impact on finite resources and the impact on the environment, we sure should move away from a nuclear sector that uses 4%, and then when it comes out, it's at the highest level of radiotoxicity, and then you try and throw it away, and we haven't been able to do it. And on top of it, I didn't mention, Steve, that when you recycle, the beauty of nuclear engineering, the beauty of chemistry, and the beauty of fission and transmutation in the nuclear field is, when we recycle this material, we're going to do what's called a full recycle. We're going to recycle every isotope that has market opportunity. Like I said, we've identified 11. We have offtake agreements for almost all of them. And that's not even including the isotope, the uranium isotope UF6 that we'll be pulling off, that will be the feedstock for fuel for our nuclear reactors. And oh, by the way, it doesn't include the business of being in the waste disposal business. In other words, we will take per metric ton that material stranded on your pad utility X. We can do it for half the price than the French are doing with their La Hague facility. So it really is a no-brainer. And that's why I've been trying to make the case with my colleagues in the nuclear sector that if you really want to grow the pie, let's once and for all become a circular economy. Let's be a circular economy market. And it is eminently doable. The least difficult thing is the technical deployment. The most difficult is getting past our preformed negative views that we've had generationally on nuclear. We've been led to believe it's nuclear waste. And I didn't mention this one last point. When the beauty of the science of nucleonics, of used nuclear fuel, is when you do a full recycle, when you recycle all of our products, pull it out, you only have our estimates now, our scientists, we're proving this out with the national labs now. We will only have about at most 4% of the original high-level radioactive waste after we reprocess. And on top of it, it will only have to be stored for about 300 years until it's safe for humans to walk around it. Only, but compared to 100,000 years. So we reduce it by 4%, the problem. We do it not on the backs of the taxpayers. We do it in an environmentally friendly way, in a security built in by design way. And it's going to be a tech corridor for domestic economic benefit and domestic energy security. That's why I left my position in government, because it's still hard, but breaking through the web of sort of misunderstood aspects. Some things are absolutely legitimate. We have to be able to deal with even the remaining waste, and that has to be taken care of, and we will. Eminently easier when you only have 4%. Suddenly you have boreholes you can put it in. You don't need a $100 billion Yucca Mountain plus 2, and that's not even close because of all the other costs that you have associated with it. And how many people realize the federal government has been sued by utilities because of that law I told you, the law that was passed, Nuclear Waste Policy Act, that Congress says the Department of Energy, you are now responsible for picking up that material and disposing of it permanently. Oh, by the way, Congress said, I know it's going to cost you, so now you're authorized, the federal government's authorized to essentially tax the utilities that have nuclear reactors. And then it's called 1 mil per kilowatt hour, but that adds up real quick. And so that essentially was passed on to anybody who was getting electricity from the utility that had nuclear power plants. They were paying a tax. That tax is built up now. It's called the Nuclear Waste Fund. It's now almost $50 billion. But Congress, the law says that it only can be used for a non-recycled approach, putting in a Yucca Mountain. Clearly that needs to change. But the kicker, Steve, is that since the utility sued the federal government for failing to pick up the material, yet charging them with interest tune of almost $50 billion, that's not right. So the court sided, and it made its way through court. And by the time it was decided upon, it was like 2013, and President Obama was in charge. The court said two things. Number one, you need to pay federal government, these utilities, compensatory damage for the costs that they're incurring since 97 or 8. The cost, all the security, everything of maintaining and storing this used nuclear fuel, number one. And number two, you need to cease and desist on taxing them for something that you failed to do. So that is called the judgment fund. And the federal government, in addition to the taxpayers who paid in to the nuclear waste fund, now the federal government pays the court-assessed fines through the general treasury, a separate pot of funds, and it's called the judgment fund. So whenever the federal government gets sued, they pay the damages from the judgment fund. The nuclear industry is the single largest user of the judgment fund. And so we are now paying annually almost $1 billion a year. You can make this up. There was not one person that decided, I want to have something this out of whack done. It's a cumulative thing over years, policies, support nuclear or not, everything else. But it is what it is. And we're in a part, but as a former senior government official, I've always felt one of the sweet spots for industry is when the federal government has a problem and has not figured out a solution. And if there was ever a problem where the solution has not been identified, it's in the nuclear waste business. And it's a win-win-win-win. It's a win for the taxpayer if the private sector can come up with a way of self-sustaining financial model and not need $1 trillion or whatever it's going to cost. It's a win for the environment. It's a win for a domestic energy supply, it not being dependent on Russia. It is a win for investors because this is going to be hundreds of X return. The key is patience. Nuclear doesn't happen quick. A lot of good reasons, regulatory, all that. But we think we're going to have we can start revenue generation as early as 4 to 5 years for isotope production, and then by certainly 10 years have a full juggernaut tech corridor backbone recycling. And then we have other advanced reactors we're developing that are optimized with the fuel and the recycling facility. It'll be a tech corridor, but other medical isotope manufacturers and others will set up shop around. That's why the states love this idea. We've been engaging with county executives and mayors, and what a beautiful thing if we could, and we're a stakeholder conscience company, if we could set up shop and create a tech corridor, generational jobs at a level one of the county execs and mayors said after we gave them the briefing on the facility, they said, so you said 3,000, most of them trades. Yep, coal mine, we can have the coal miners, we can have them retrained. Said they would be optimal type of trades to be retrained. And one said, so what's the salary like? $18, $20 an hour? We said, oh no. And you can look this up in the Nuclear Energy Institute's website. It's public information. The average salary of a nuclear facility employee, including, for example, our nuclear recycling, will start probably at about $89,000 a year, not $18 an hour. This is generational jobs. A facility will be around for at least 50 years, if not longer. You'll have the ancillary facilities setting up shop to manufacture and get those products in a market, and up to a good 120, 130,000, the average salaries. So these are it's so amazing to think about the impact you could have. And you remember I said early on, I'm driven by wanting to be positive and have a positive impact, be useful. I can't think of a way before my time's up to be useful than to really help transform the nuclear sector. Again, a little bit the way SpaceX has done with the space industry.
Well, and patience, I think, is when you talked about patience, it's when we talk about sustainability most of the time, it's this idea of having a patient urgency. I think when you look at oh no, the world's going to end, we must do this, that type of mindset, it often creates this need for panic decisions. And when you do those types of decisions, you don't necessarily know what the long tail of that is. We talk about the fact that plastic wasn't a bad invention. It's actually a brilliant invention, very much in society, but we didn't think about the long-term cycle of it. How do we recycle it? How do we use it again? And instead it became this chase your tail thing that now we're so far behind, we don't know what to do with all of it. And very much like the nuclear sector. And when you're patient in those decisions, you're able to think a little bit more mindfully of what can be the solution that is sustainable for a period of time, and not just sustainable from an environmental standpoint, sustainable as a business model, as an economic model, as a human-facing model. And this idea of, I think that we're living in one of the most fascinating times in human history. We have technology, we have materials, we have energy, we have all of these things that are actually at our disposal. And it's, I want to say, a human responsibility to do it not only in a responsible way, but a positive way. And so as we start to look at, the application of nuclear energy, I still think it has this, well, what about for the workers? Do they get negative impacted, radiation poisoning, all this stuff over a period of time? And I think a lot of this is a base of lack of education on really where the industry is now. And I guess my question would be from a safety standpoint, regardless of the waste and, the ability of a nuclear meltdown and all of that kind of stuff, what's the safety side? Because I think that's the buy-in from the public. I think first thing is safety. I wouldn't want, you look in cartoons, and whenever there's nuclear related things in cartoon, it's always glowing and it's like this horrible thing. So
Simpsons and others, or Godzilla and some of his greatest arch rivals.
Yeah. So how do you, I guess, educate on the safety side of it, of being a long-term solution? Because even if you look at lithium mining in general, lithium's not exactly a clean process either. And so what does it look like from a safety perspective when you look into, okay, let's assume government says, let's do this. We're going to do all of it. We're going to go all in on nuclear. We're going to be able to power the entire world at a fraction of the cost, fraction of the material, fraction of the mining. and we're going to be able to recycle and help people in so many different sectors. What's the buy-in for the public?
Yeah, and for me, there's two parts to the answer for the value proposition. Number one is we have the most stringently regulated from a safety perspective, nuclear sector in the world. Even with 3 Mile Island, I hate to bring it up, but hey, it is what it is. We did not have any major release where there were individuals around the nuclear power plant exposed. I worked 30 years in the Department of Energy. Whenever I go to national labs, in general, you have to wear a dosimeter badge. And the dosimeter badge detects radiation exposure.
It's the old sound, right?
Well, it won't even, that's like a Geiger counter you're thinking about. This passive sensor, and it won't alarm. It just passively picks up readings or exposure. And of course, that's in addition to using active detection equipment at the labs, but it's redundant. I mean, you have multiple layers. And so you always have to wear a dosimeter badge. For my 30 years career, for the most part, periodically I would get a letter in the mail, and it would be a table, and it would show all the different times and exposure levels for radiation, gamma, beta, alpha. And in my entire career, and I've been to a lot of places all over the world, Russian nuclear warhead sites and others, I have never had a reading over zero, nominal reading. I've never had any exposure. We're so stringent. I think it's because there's such concern about safety. I've always thought part of it is because radiation is colorless, odorless, right? And so there's something inherent about fitting into this narrative that, oh my gosh, so the only way I'll know if I got exposed is if the government tells me, and I don't trust the government. So I know I can see where people come from, where they are reluctant, if not suspicious or averse to nuclear safety perspective. But we have demonstrated in our generations, all the way back to the 50s, we can do this in an incredibly safe way. And we know how to, and now the next generation of reactors are step change improvement. The reactors right now are operated very well and safe, but the advanced reactors that are coming into market, some of them, they're inherently safe, where literally if you have no human intervention, that reactor shutting down with no release, no core melt, no nothing, no Fukushima, no Chernobyl. Almost all the reactors coming in, including ours, we call it the HOPE reactor, and it is atmospheric and it could never have a Fukushima, certainly not a core melt because it's a liquid core. So that's one thing I wanted to say, Steve, that actually we have shown over and over and over in generations that we are meticulous at making sure. That's the one thing we do is we are meticulous about radiation exposure, and we have the strongest standards in the world. But the second part of the answer is my others. We have two businesses in my company. One is dealing with the nuclear waste, and then the other is turning it into products and, oh, by the way, developing advanced reactors that match up to it. So from an environmental safety perspective, you really should. Anybody who's concerned, as you said, my view is, I'd say, I want to see companies like Curio get its butt out there quickly and take care of it. Because let me get this straight. If the concern is having material that is unsafe to be around, it's not just an environmental issue when you have material there for 100,000 years. It's because it's a safety issue too, where you can't have humans go by. That's why you have the nuclear regulatory standard for 1 million years. And 100,000 years. So when we solve the environmental problem by getting rid of most of the high-level waste and then burying the rest 9,000 feet down in a borehole you'll never see again in our lifetime, in our civilization, you're also eliminating largely the health threat because you're getting rid of that. So my view is, I would say, whether or not you support nuclear, I want someone to take care of a high-level radioactive material that's sitting around the 75 locations in 35 states around this country and adding 2,000 more every year. I want someone to take care of it, not just tell me you're going to put it in the ground for 1 million years. And when you recycle it, you're going to, so you're telling me there are companies out there right now that believe that they can reduce by 96% the high-level radioactive material that I'm scared of from a health perspective? Again, it's a no-brainer. We've spoken to a lot of members of Congress. I've spoken to directly probably over 100 on this, and then good probably 24 senators. I have yet to find a single member that said, I disagree with you. More often than not, they say, why haven't we done this already? I don't know if you saw, even to show you the potential or the overlap of nuclear technologies and the nuclear sector and approaches to it, the overlap between the two parties. AOC Cortez goes to Fukushima. And then to our surprise, and it was a wonderful surprise, it was great to see. I wasn't sure how familiar she was with the so-called nuclear waste issue. Well, apparently she's pretty familiar with it because she was, there was an article, in fact, I was quoted in that article. That's how we saw the article. But it was her leaving Fukushima, and they interviewed her, and she said, oh, by the way, what we should start doing in our country is reprocessing from an energy efficiency and environmental perspective. It's like, wow, she gets it. And Senator Cruz, I thought when we went in to see him, I thought we were going to have to explain what reprocessing is. He said, oh, by the way, here, come over. And he calls one of his staff in and says, hey, tell Curio about this recycling legislation we're pushing, and we're going to push with bipartisan support. So there is real opportunity. Senator Heinrich from New Mexico, we're working with the staff, very interested in recycling. We've had even others from a whole slew, Democrat, Republican. That's what I mean by we have a unique opportunity. It's not only a no-brainer, but it is a sense of urgency, Steve. Even if 10 years seems like it's not, in the nuclear business, bringing in something like that, that's a fast track. We're described as ambitious. It is a sense of urgency, but it's decisive, steady, lessons learned in every which way. I think our biggest challenge is not the technical, it's not the economics, it's the socio and the policy and the legal. We have a path. It's not illegal for us to cut a contract with the utility right now to take title of their used nuclear fuel. We'd have to get a license from the NRC, you betcha. But the NRC says that it can't issue a permanent repository license for the remaining high-level waste, except for Yucca until the law's changed. And the utilities can't access the nuclear waste fund that their ratepayers paid in because it's fenced off for Yucca. So while it's not illegal for us to do basically interim, take the title and do something on an interim basis, even if that is 100 years or so or more. But a complete solution and a just one from a standpoint of the taxpayers having access to do this, there's adjustments that need to be made.
Well, and where's nuclear, I guess, byproducts? I mean, you mentioned space rovers. I mean, it's, dare I say, proliferated into society in ways that I don't think we realize. Where is it already just being applied?
Oh my gosh, so many places. I was in Vienna at the IAEA. I don't want to say the fact because it was told to me by a senior IAEA, International Atomic Energy, United Nations nuclear watchdog. Told me, he said, Ed, you know how common radioisotopes are in the food industry, food safety, that every McDonald's French fry is irradiated to ensure it's safe. But do the companies want to go around saying, hey, buy my product, and we've just exposed it to radiation sources? Well, we live in radiation. The sun is radioactive. We're surrounded by that. In the right dosage, it saves lives. In the right dosage, it fights cancer, cesium-137, strontium-90. There are some incredibly exciting new breakthrough cancer-fighting techniques using radioisotopes when you combine a recycling facility like mine, an advanced reactor, test reactor or whatever, it doesn't have to be a large reactor, such as actinium-225. Bill Gates, now I think he's just about the only company, his company, TerraPower, has a limited supply, but nowhere near what is needed worldwide. Actinium-225 is a remarkable isotope. It allows you, this isotope will attach itself to an antibody in your body, and it will hitchhike on there. And that antibody, when it goes at a cancer cell, normally it gets confused and it thinks it's not cancer and nothing happened. This is like a hand grenade. and it hitches a ride. It's called targeted alpha therapy. And it hitches a ride on an antibody in your body, and it hits and destroys cancer cells. And the beauty is the half-life of the daughter product, some of it is trade secrets, but some of the isotopes that are derived from it, the daughter products and actinium-225, has such a short half-life that the radiation disappears in some therapies within about 8 hours from your body. So that's why I was saying, too, that it's almost like these are perishable. Some of these isotopes last thousands of years. Some of them, like plutonium-238, will half-life or whatever it is, like 80, 90 years, to sufficient enough to power the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 aircraft. Some, they will last 2 days, right? And so our recycling facility will likely have medical facilities there. And then the minute we extract them, they get them over there. And then you inject it or you insinuate in the body, it goes after the cancer, and then the radiation disappears. Targeted alpha therapy. That's just an example. And so, look, there are isotopes that are used to detect leaks in our nuclear reactors, for example, defense or whatever it is. There are isotopes that are now being developed, very exciting, for nanodiamond batteries, and they don't have to apply. We have an agreement with one of those companies. And so very, very disruptive, exciting. So we literally have identified 11 isotopes thus far that are sitting in the so-called nuclear waste, and already priced them out. And like I said, just one of these isotopes, I'm not going to say which one, we priced out to be a $2 billion a year revenue. And again, that doesn't include the $1 to $2 billion a year business of just taking the so-called waste off the shoulders of the utilities and the American taxpayer. So it is an incredible time. Like you said, the innovation that we're seeing in all aspects of our lives is breathtaking. And we're lucky we're living in this time. But we're lucky that the people willing to take risks. There was a former Nobel laureate, may he rest in peace. He passed away a number of years ago, and he was on my advisory board. And he said, "You know what's wrong with this country, McGinnis?" I said, "What, sir?" He said, "Problem now is we equate not succeeding at something or failing as a bad thing." He said, "In my business," and I think he discovered a new particle, and he was recognized Nobel laureate. And he said, "Do you know how many efforts it takes to have a true breakthrough? How many people have to try and fail and get an inch further, that door, until finally you get the breakthrough? It takes sometimes thousands of efforts failed. And then if you're smart enough about it, you'll do lessons learned. You'll learn from those efforts, and then you can get across the goal line." That's what we're about. We're about due diligence and learning from all those efforts. I don't say it in a negative way that no one has figured out the nuclear waste problem. Smarter people than me, more capable than me, have tried for decades and have not solved the U.S. nuclear waste problem. But we are now the beneficiary of all those efforts. And now we're in a unique position to do it if we're smart enough to do due diligence. And that's why we tell our investors, look, we have due diligenced the heck out of this. And we brought in insiders, outsiders, academics, disruptors. We have a whole sort of combination of what we think is going to be needed with our national labs to once and for all pull it off. So before I'm 6 feet under, I hope and pray that I can look back and say, yeah, we were part of transforming the U.S. nuclear sector into a truly circular, sustainable, and fully potential realized sector.
Wow. Well, first of all, the amount of knowledge that I think this conversation has provided for, every single listener, not only myself, is huge. And the impact and the potential of this is fundamentally world-changing. And I think one of the bigger lessons in it is your journey and path in that, right? It's this ability that anybody can actually do anything. It's the willingness to try and fail and iterate and keep going, chase it, believe in it.
Even a little kid, a guy from Metairie, almost taken away from his mother, didn't get much science to background and everything else. We all can play a role. And I think working really hard, but being humble yet confident. And I mentor a fair amount of people, and I tell them that, in my humble opinion, everybody has their own winning combination, however optimized. But my view is you need to be all confident enough to step up to the plate, and you can go after the most audacious, ambitious thing, just like anybody else. And if you can do 1 + 1, if you can just use building blocks of logic, you can figure just about anything out. If you break it down, dissect it to a logic level that makes sense to you, then you reassemble it. You can understand just about anything, but be humble too. Sort of, it's like audacious enough to go for it, never say no, go through 10-foot walls if you need to, but also be humble enough to know that you're not the only one that sees it. My old boss, chief of staff, when I was brought on board and moved in, they could tell I was all excited. And first board executive meeting I was in, and the chief of staff guy, former Air Force guy too, he pulls me over and says, "Ed, I can tell you're excited. But just remember, at this level, everybody around the table is smart. And everybody around the table, they all have a lot of good ideas too. So just measure yourself." I can tell you're chomping at the bit, but it really is about, because some people can be so smart, they're dumb. In other words, the minute they think they don't have anything else to learn from others, that's when things can go really wrong. And then you can suddenly step back and say, how on earth did we logically get to this point? Because it makes no sense. So just hard work and being humble. But I agree. I mean, we literally, any and all of us can be part of things that can really change the world.
Well, one of the last questions, and it's a question that we ask every single guest on the podcast, is where is your favorite place on the planet to enjoy nature? And you, thankfully, have been able to travel all over the world.
That's a good one. My answer might surprise you. When I was the chair of GNUP, we had 60-something countries at the time, and we rotated. Every time we had a different meeting, it was at a different country. There are 2 countries that stand out from a nature perspective I love more than any. But if I had to pick one, it would be Mongolia. Mongolia it's just takes your breath away. It's so majestic. It's the most sparsely populated country in the world, the highest percentage of nomadic population still, the highest percentage of shamanists. Not that religion is important, but it's just, it is so almost untouched by modernity. Ulaanbaatar, majority of the population is there, but I've been there twice and gone all over the country near the Russian border. It was magical. It was sort of Roman Catholic, but it was Zen-like, and the people were beautiful. And so, yeah, and very Western friendly. And you go out there and stay over in these gers, and it's something out of a dream. So yeah, Mongolia gets my vote.
Well, thank you just so much for taking the time and talking nuclear energy. I think it's and just your personal story. I think it's inspiring, and it's something that hopefully people that are listening realize that they can do the same, whether that be nuclear energy, whether that be whatever they decide that they're passionate about and want to chase after. But realistically, I think the world has an opportunity for a very, very bright future, an energetic future, and one that I think it's uncharted. And I just wanted to thank you for taking the time and being the pioneer in that area, because we need that. We need that more than ever, just across the planet, to have the people willing to say, why not? And be curious enough to wonder what could be around the next corner. So thank you.
And Steve, I want to thank you for that. And also thank you for what you're doing, because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you and this discussion. And now it's going to become a very important vehicle to hopefully share in a positive way with others. So what you're doing is to be commended. It's inspiring to see what you're doing. And so I wish you all the best as well.
Perfect.
Thank you for listening to the Sustainable Goat podcast. I'm your host, Steve Cassingham. With each episode, we can further define what it means to create a truly sustainable and resilient future.
I think the new status is to show that you actually care. You want to drive change and you want to be part of a sustainable future.
People fight for what they love.
Let's really all start for a small but significant shift in the way we live, we consume, and we plan our life.
Join us at sustainablegoat.com.